Today is Sunday, the 15th of August 2021. The latest reports say that the Taliban jihadist army of radical Sunni Islamists is on the outskirts of the capital city, Kabul. In less than 7 days, they have swept the country. This is unprecedented. American media reports say their planning and conduct of the war has been nothing short of brilliant. They say they have never strategized like this in 20 years of warfare. How is it possible? Well, we smell a rat. 4 weeks ago, the president of Afghanistan, Ashraf Ghani, warned Pakistan. He said, "We know that after the Taliban signed a peace agreement with the Americans, that the Pakistanis, when the Americans said we're going to leave on September the 11th for the 20th anniversary, that 10,000 jihadis crossed the border from Pakistan." Pakistanis, of course, deny it. Now, in 1979, when the war started against the Russians till 1989, the war was funded by the Saudis. The equipment came from China and Egypt. You can see that in Charlie Wilson's War, starring Tom Hanks. The Americans coordinated it, but they hired Saudi people like Osama bin Laden, who were the logistics people. They ensured the delivery of supplies, weapons, ammunition, all the things that a real army needs. And the Pakistanis conducted the intelligence, and they conducted the training of the troops. The Mujahideen, they were then called. Now they're called the Taliban or Talib, or students of madrasas. The madrasas are funded by the Saudi government and other Gulf states like Kuwait, UAE, other medieval despotisms. Absolute monarchies. These are places where people are stoned to death, people have limbs amputated, people are beheaded. No idea of modernism at all. These people fund the madrasas, but the Pakistanis, whereas the Americans, and this led to 9/11, have 16 rival intelligence agencies who do not share information. The Pakistanis only have one, the Inter-Services Intelligence Agency, ISI. It's like the CIA plus the FBI plus Homeland Security plus everything. It's very similar to the old KGB, but it's military as well as civilian, and it coordinates all Taliban activity. As it coordinated the war against the Russians, it defeated the Russians, so the Pakistani ISI had a great victory there. Now they've had a great victory over the Americans. Pakistan is playing its own game, but they're funded by the Saudis. How do we know this? Not a couple of years ago, the Pakistanis developed the first, what they call the Islamic bomb. They said they were afraid of the Hindus across the border, the Indians, one of the biggest countries in the world, and they got a bomb. But that bomb was funded by the Saudi government. So the Saudis are putting up the cash for things around the world, and where they get the cash from, they get it from the US taxpayers who pay top dollar for Saudi oil. Now, back in 1990, there was an opportunity to destroy the Saudi despotism. The Americans encouraged Saddam Hussein to invade Kuwait. We have a report, April Glasby, who was the US ambassador to Iraq, is recorded as having a meeting, and she said to Saddam, "I know you've got a dispute with Kuwait, settle it before I get back from my holidays in 2 weeks' time." The day she left, the day after, Saddam invaded Kuwait, and he had conquered the place within 6 hours. That was all right with the Americans. For 2 weeks they said nothing. Then they came up with this bizarre story that his real goal is to invade the Saudi oil fields. The next thing you know, the Americans invaded Saudi with 500,000 troops. Then they invaded Iraq, defeated Iraq via Kuwait, crippled the regime. That's 1990, 91. They put it under sanctions for 13 years, and then in 2003 they invaded Iraq. 2004 they murdered Saddam and his two sons, Uday and Qusay. Now, what's this got to do? The Americans had the choice in 1990 to support the Saudi despotism, this medieval dictatorship, this absolute monarchy which hasn't been seen in Europe since the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, or a modern Arab nationalist dictator. Yes, he's a dictator, he's a militarist, but he was much more progressive. He had a socialist state that was free this, free that, free everything. He used his oil wealth to placate the population. The same in Syria, the same in Libya. Now, after Saddam was toppled in 2003, then along came the Arab Spring in 2011. The Americans toppled the socialist state in Libya. They attempted to topple the socialist state in Syria. These were all nationalist Arab governments, ostensibly secular. The jihadists, unlike in Saudi Arabia, were locked up. They weren't exported to commit murder around the world. But America was supporting the Saudis. Now, why did they do that? Why would they support a government who was anti-democratic, anti-Christ, anti-European, against these nationalist secularists who were halfway? If you've got despotism here, you've got total democracy there, Swedish-style democracy, civil liberties, all the rest of it, protection, free speech. And these guys were halfway. They had parliaments, even though they were rubber stamp parliaments. They had elections, even though they were fake elections. They were halfway. They were a bit like the Eastern European states during the Soviet occupation. They had the outworking of democracy. And once the wall came down in 1989 and the Soviet Union influence dissipated in Eastern Europe, all those countries, Poland, Hungary, Romania, all the others, their parliaments became democratic, and they still are. The Arabs were in that halfway place, but the Americans in 1990 chose the wrong course. They chose to support absolutist regimes. They liberated Kuwait, and George Bush at the time boasted, he said, "Oh, I am not invading Kuwait to make the world safe for despotism and feudalism," but that's exactly what he did. So that was 1990. This is 31 years later. We now have a despotic regime being reinstalled in Kabul, funded by the Saudis, aided by the Pakistanis, equipped with American equipment. Amazingly, we see them driving around in American equipment. We can only think that America backed the wrong side 30 years ago, and it has corrupted America from the inside. It has eaten them away. In 2011, the Americans launched the Arab Spring. Now, their avowed goal was to bring democracy to the Middle East and North Africa, MENA, M-E-N-A. So they toppled the socialist regime in Tunisia. They toppled the socialist regime in Libya. They tried to topple the socialist regime in Syria. They toppled the socialist regime in Yemen. They almost toppled the despotism in Bahrain. They toppled the military dictatorship in Egypt. And their next goal was Iran, but they didn't have any luck there. What happened in Egypt? Well, in 2011, there were protests. In 2012, there were elections. The military dictator, 86-year-old general, was put in jail briefly, but the Muslim Brotherhood won the election. Now, these are semi-democrats. They're jihadists, but they agreed to use the ballot box. Now, the Muslim Brotherhood have been the government in Jordan under the king for many years. They've been the government in Turkey for many years. They lasted 1 year. In Egypt, allegedly, Qatar paid the military $3 billion to step down from power, but the Saudis intervened after a year and gave the military $4 billion to topple the regime. So the Saudis didn't want the example of nationalist, democratic, semi-democratic regimes to their people. They give the example, you've got only two alternatives. There's liberalism and European sewer type society where pornography and prostitution and drug addiction and suicidal teenagers and violence and just filth on the one hand, or our puritanical society. They could not stand the idea of their people being seduced by this halfway. People like Saddam, like Assad in Syria, like the Tunisian government, like the Libyans, where a despot was a liberal socialist who had a democratic, well, semi-democratic parliament, had political parties, had media, free media, and there weren't beheadings and stonings and all the rest. The Saudis were terrified of the Arabs being shown that yes, Arab people could be liberal, they could be democratic, they could have parliaments, they could have elections. They couldn't stand that. They couldn't risk that temptation. So the Arab Spring had to be crushed. So 1 year after the Morsi government was elected, the Muslim Brotherhood government was elected in Egypt, they were toppled. Great loss of life then and since. They've gone back to a military dictatorship. Now this, to look at the enormity of this event, in 2013, when the Morsi government was toppled after 1 year, it was the first democratic government, first elected government in 5,000 years of recorded history in Egypt. And the Saudis toppled it. Now the Saudis have launched a war in Yemen to crush independence groups there, the Houthis. They've funded the war in Syria. They are behind ISIS. They've funded the war in Iraq. The terrorism is their main game. And now they are taking the war to their friends and in America, in Afghanistan, and they're funding the Talibs. And the Talibs are being led, I believe, by ISI officers. They've been trained. This brilliant strategy, they didn't pull that out of the hat. I think they're being led by Pakistani officers. Now, we found there are instances in Syria that when the Free Syrian Army and other ISIS groups, Al-Qaeda groups, terrorist groups, Al-Nusra, Al-Sham, various groups. And remember, in some places there are 54 different factions fighting the Assad semi-democratic socialist government. They've captured Saudi officers, intelligence officers, British intelligence officers, American intelligence officers. In Aleppo, they found all three of these nations' officers in a bunker, and they were forced to allow them to escape. So we're coming across foreign leaders, and I believe they've reappeared in the Taliban. So the Taliban may ride into Kabul soon, but it won't be their doing. They're the tools of others, and the Americans bit the bullet in 1990. 30 years ago, they chose the wrong course. Now, if America is made a fool of in Afghanistan, it's because they backed the Saudi despots. They backed the medieval, backward regime when they could have supported Saddam. Saddam could have taken over the Saudis, could have taken over Kuwait, which was originally an Iraqi province before the British stole it off them, just for the oil. It's oil, oil, oil. If you go back through the American elite families, oil, this addiction to oil. Now, Don Rumsfeld died a week ago. He was 88 years old. He started the war in Iraq. He started the war in Afghanistan, and he died worth $200 million now. He didn't get that from his public service pension. Oil has destroyed America. People are going to fight wars against people their government are actually funding. This is crazy. This has got to stop.